Welcome everyone to the next episode of Cloud 101, Realizing the True Potential of Cloud Media Operations. I'm your host, Peter Wharton, the Director of Corporate Strategy for TAG V.S. Systems, and thank you for joining us today. Alana, I just want to make sure we get everything okay. Sound good? Perfect. Okay, thank you. So let's get started. We've been through a few episodes so far of this. So in the first one we talked about why the cloud. In the second episode we talked about is the cloud there yet? And we talked in the last episode about cloud migration challenges. So this time around, we're going to talk about recipe for a successful migration. And thank you for joining us today. So what is a recipe for a successful cloud migration? Well, in this session, we're going to talk about designing cloud architectures, what will the cloud cost, evaluating choices, and building your cloud. So to begin with, let's start over. Let's throw out all those old assumptions and conventions. And the second part of designing a cloud architecture is design where you want to end up. Look at that finish line. Make that where you really go for. And thirdly, let's talk about migrating, working your way backwards to where you are now to make everything work. So let's start over. Current media systems are built on decades of legacy workflows and technical limitations. You know what I'm talking about. If you look at the way a master control switcher is designed, for example, it follows on from the very first design in 1960 by CBS. The production switchers we use today follow on the same principles of the Grass Valley 300 that we saw in Star Wars back in the 70s and 80s, right? We're using the same technologies, and yes, it's improving, it's getting better, but fundamentally, we're still trying to expand on workflows we developed based on technologies that are sometimes 50 and 60 years old. We also, because of those technologies, have developed silos and formats and processes and limitations that are imposed by these legacy systems. We still work in live production and post-production and play-out and distribution models, right? Those are still silos of workflows for most operations. And the cloud is the perfect opportunity to reinvent how we do these media workflows and to think about leaving this legacy baggage behind. Because only when we do that will we really realize the full benefits of the cloud. So where do you really want to end up here? You want to design for where you want to be, not where you are at this moment. You want to break down these silos, build end-to-end workflows, and adopt modern media principles and designs. So how will you get there from here? Well, the first step is to build the cloud workflows for where you actually want to be, to really envision that and build those workflows first. And then to make it work with your existing workflows so that you can transition to these new ones, you'll build shims in the cloud to migrate and connect to these various workflows, converters, and landscapes. So what you end up with are things like files transcoding to migrate everything to the file formats you want in the cloud, traffic processing to adapt legacy traffic systems to current systems, or maybe replace your traffic system altogether, signal conversion to move it to signals that we want in the cloud. Obviously we're digital, but you might be also specific compressed formats or even uncompressed in the cloud these days. And metadata translation. So for example, if you're moving a station group to the cloud, every station might have a different naming convention. Or especially if you're doing a merger and acquisition and integrating with someone else as part of this. Again, you're going to have to normalize all your metadata and define the schema to run in the cloud. And likewise, automation, you're going to probably want a single automation system in the cloud, and you're going to want to make your control surfaces work for the cloud. So fundamentally, we're going to make all these changes, but at the end, we're going to make these changes to make the cloud work without making those changes in the cloud itself in the new workflows, but going into them. So what will this cost? That's a big challenge in building cloud workflows. How much do cloud systems cost? So the first stop is to build a cloud cost analysis worksheet. This is a complicated thing we'll talk about in a minute. And then from there you actually want to figure out what is the total cost of ownership in the cloud. Because unlike building an on-premises system, you have to take into account time in the cost of a cloud as well. And lastly, there's the value of intangibles. So what does the cloud cost worksheet look like? Well, it values the cost of running workflows in the cloud. These are not only just the cloud costs, but also the vendor costs. And you want to be able to compare the costs of different vendors and solutions. You want to understand which are the more economical ones or which ones you're willing to pay more for, but they have certain benefits. And they're going to have very different pricing models when you make this comparison. And you're going to want to include system requirements like the number of channels and signals as variables so that you can actually model different size systems and different parameters. And you're going to want to account for things like variables for file sizes, storage, bandwidth, and how long you want to keep files, persistence, and such. And finally, out of all this, once you've built this worksheet, you should be able to run what-if scenarios. You should be able to look at how the system will scale, and what was the cost for redundancy or business continuity plans. So when you build a cloud worksheet, it can be very complex. This is just some screenshots of one I built a while ago. But I built these to be able to figure out how, what the cost is for different channels with different workflows and how many of each of those I ran, and then to look across different vendors and their costs, and to also look at all the costs in the cloud and such. And it takes a while to get this right. It's very complicated because there's a lot of things to understand about this. So when you look at the difficulties of building a comprehensive cost modeling worksheet, there's the volume of cloud cost metrics I've taken into account. There's so many different things that you can be billed for and running in the cloud, right? And it's pretty scary at first when you look at this. And then there's a difference in vendor price models and architectures. Some have CapEx, some have OpEx, some do different time periods, all these different models that they have, and somehow you have to build those into your workflow as well. Changes in cost over time, quantity, consumption, volume. So, for example, if you're in Amazon, your storage costs change as you go to higher tiers. They get cheaper. And likewise, things like data and other parts of this. But on the other hand, with certain vendors, the delta when it actually changes might be different. It might not just be about the volume of consumption, but you may be able to run so much in a certain server, and then you need to move to one more server. So at each server increment, you have this big jump in cost for a very small change in quantity. So you need to be able to quantify those differences and be able to factor that into your worksheet. And how many of these variables are actually going to drive your calculations? But fundamentally, how precise do we need to be? These are some of the questions we need to be able to answer. So your cloud costs. And after having done all this and done some really detailed analysis, fundamentally, the bulk of your cloud costs are going to come from your compute instances, the servers you actually run your workloads on, your egress costs, the cost of bringing content out of the cloud, and the storage costs, the cost for keeping content in the cloud. Interestingly enough, when you move to the cloud, the cost of getting content to the cloud is not charged for by the cloud vendor, presumably because they want you to push lots of content to the cloud. That's great when you're moving files. It's really great when you're doing live workflows with lots of streams going to the cloud. So keep that in mind. So on the vendor side, we've seen CapEx models, we've seen OpEx models. With subscriptions, we've seen software as a service models that include the underlying services in the cloud and fully managed services. And so being able to correlate all of those and compare them from one vendor to another is very complicated because they don't exactly use the same work models. And some of them charge for commissioning in different rates and different things, and some charge different amounts for support. They have different licenses they charge for, so some may not charge for some features, others do, that you might want. And then again, how it scales and how they use shared resources and the different increments within that is going to affect your calculations. And finally, what options do you actually need, and make sure you calculate for those and be able to break those out so you know whether or not you really want those options. So finally, the question was, how precise do we need to be? And the answer is you don't need to be perfectly exact here, but you do need to be able to compare those vendor costs and understand those cloud costs and understand how costs change with different assumptions and as you scale, because that'll really give you great insight on what it's going to cost to move to the cloud and run in the cloud and the opportunities the cloud will create for you. So moving to the cloud is more than just comparing cloud costs to the cost of on-premises hardware. It's about total cost of ownership. And what is total cost of ownership? It's the cost with everything included over a specific period of time. So typically, people talk about 3 years or 5 years total cost of ownership as a metric to compare to the cloud. It's not always going to be a perfect number. I know customers of mine who run the same systems for over 10 years, so a 3 or 5 year TCO isn't exactly going to match that. But then again, the world we're living in today is very different than 15, 20 years ago when we put in systems that lasted that long. If you remember from my first presentation, we talked about CBS's master control switcher staying on air for 41 years. Those days are long gone. So really what you're going to have to figure out is, what is this TCO period? You'll find that a lot of vendors use a 3-year amortization period for their subscription models versus their CapEx models. In that if you were to license and buy their software versus renting it as an OpEx model or with a subscription, at roughly 3 years you'd be break even. So maybe it's a longer period we really want to evaluate, like 5 years. So we really factor in those charges as well, and we make sure we're not paying too much for that software over a shorter period of time. And then also we have on-premises versus cloud. And so one of the biggest differences is that typically you'll be able to turn up systems much faster in the cloud and be able to scale up much faster once you're actually running systems. So you have to think about that, because frequently in on-premise systems, you are purchasing systems far ahead of when it actually gets to be put on air. The time it takes to build out those systems and launch them has to be factored in as part of the return on investment and the total cost of ownership costs. And really, if you're going to do true total cost of ownership, you also should not just say, well, what's the cost of running a server in the cloud versus buying a server for on-premises, but all that underlying infrastructure around that. You know, the CapEx licenses, but also your HVAC and your electricity, your UPS, your generator, your network, your infrastructure gear to support that, rack space, connectivity, engineering and IT staff. The fact that typically if you're building an on-premises system, you're overbuilding substantially over what you need today, so you will be able to deploy things in the future without taking a long time to build up. You know, and certainly if you look at like classic SDI routers, you had to overbuild substantially or run out of room very early on in its lifetime. Or then you have the cost of underbuilding and the difficulty of scaling systems that are already in place. Then you need spare parts, and you may also need to build out disaster or business continuity sites to back up your main site, whereas in the cloud that could be something you just spin up on demand. And finally, if you're building an on-premises system, you're also going to want to do periodic equipment refreshes within that period of time. So maybe every 5 or 7 years you're going to be replacing those servers. You have to account for that as well, right? So that becomes a big factor. So what are the value of intangibles? So those were all things a minute ago we could actually put numbers around, even though I'm sure there'll be a lot of disagreement about what each of those numbers might look like. But then you get to these things, the intangibles, and this is the real value of going to the cloud and how you measure these. And what are some of those intangibles? Well, there's speed of deployment. There's speed of scaling. How fast I can spin up new systems or grow my system or shrink it down, right? And there's being able to move from CapEx to OpEx subscriptions and on-demand. What is the value of not having that CapEx sunk cost spent, but instead having that reserved capital funds for other purposes and maintaining that cash? And then finally, you also have cost that mirror consumption. So if you're building an on-premise or a physical facility, you're going to have fixed costs that may have nothing to do with the consumption over a given period of time. But when you're running in the cloud, your costs will mirror your consumption. And there's huge value in that, because it really helps you create efficiency in your operations and also bill back to the various content providers or customers you have for your facility the true costs of their workloads. There's fail fast. So this ability to actually stand up test workflows and try things out, and if they don't work, terminate them quickly without any real expense except for the incremental cost of running that service in the cloud. The agility to meet changing business requirements, and this is really key to the cloud. If you're building an on-premises facility, are you going to be able to make those changes or without doing a significant change to your infrastructure, and how fast can you do that? In the cloud, the answer is if technology is available, you can spin it up and run it in very short order. Again, ability to refresh infrastructure, the same sort of thing. If you're on premises, you're going to be refreshing infrastructure and buying new equipment and depreciating old one. In the cloud, one thing that's really interesting is that every time a new technology comes out, a new infrastructure, a new server type is available in Amazon, like a new EC2 instance, it's generally going to give you more power, more storage, better performance, and at a 20% lower price than last year's model. So every year you're going to be able to upgrade to new hardware and save money. That's not something you can do in an on-premises facility. And you'll be able to change vendors easily. This is a tough thing to say, but it's actually true. If you really build cloud-optimized workflows, and you really figure out how to break down those silos and make these things really agnostic, how they work together, it should be really easy to plug in another vendor for whatever you're using today that does a better job, maybe at a better price or with additional features. And that's really key, because when you build an on-premises facility, you really are locking yourself into a solution for an extended period of time. In the cloud, you want to really avoid that lock-in. You really want to make your suppliers hungry to provide you the best technology available at a given moment. And in the cloud, I can easily create connectivity, suppliers, partners, and distributors. We'll talk about this in a later episode, but just the ease with which you can share content, create connections, and make these workflows happen with outside parties is so much easier in the cloud than it is on premises. And is the speed of these workflows. So also, in on-premises facilities, you're constantly moving content around from one part of a workflow to a different workflow to make whatever process happen on that content that you need done. But in the cloud, the content often stays in the same place and the workflow comes to it, right? I don't have to actually move my content to make it available to workflow. I just have to tell that workflow where it is, because it's all running in the cloud. It's all available everywhere based on strictly on permissions that you give to things. So this is really key to one of the key values of the cloud here. And finally, it's the rate of innovation and adoption. How fast can I adopt new technologies? How fast can I meet the changes of our business requirements or implement new capabilities? So if you look at all these intangibles, these are really hard things to put numbers against when you're trying to compare the cost of refreshing an on-premises facility versus moving in the cloud. But once you start trying to put some numbers against this, I think you're going to find on-premises facilities have a really hard time keeping pace anymore. So what will it cost? Well, by the time you build the cloud worksheet, model and analyze all the scenarios and vendors, define your total cost of ownership assumptions, and try to factor in every intangible, well, you'll never get there. You'll be missing a tooth like this gear here, because it's an impossible task, right? It's just too much, and it also takes too much time, and part of going to the cloud is about speed. But you should at least make an effort to go down this road and try to understand the core costs, because in doing so, you'll find what the real costs are for a lot of your workflows that really matter. And you'll also be able to understand your vendor costs and cloud costs and understand how these costs change with assumptions and scale. And this is really key, because it's getting that insight, this mission one. It'll help you make some really important decisions as we move forward by understanding these costs. So the next thing is, how do we leverage cloud economics? So not all workflows in the cloud doing the same workload are going to cost the same. And this is one of the big surprises I found with a lot of my customers, is they just assume that all these things sort of run the same way and cost the same amount, because they always did that on premises and servers. You bought a server, it did this function, and that was that, right? But in the cloud, you're paying for everything you're running and how efficiently it runs. And there are ways to reduce these costs. So instead of standing up a server full-time and leaving it running from now until eternity, you can do things like serverless, where you're actually throwing code at the cloud and saying, run this wherever you want, and I'm only going to pay you for CPU cycles. Not only is that very economical, you're only paying for the actual work required to exercise that process, but you're not also paying and waiting for the time it takes to move that application to a server and start that server and have that server up and running and validate that server is working. And likewise, the time it takes to shut it down. So you're only paying for the time it actually runs. That makes it very economical. Another way is spot instances. Spot instances are where you run transient workflows. Maybe it's a transcode process. Maybe it's just a media check. But it's one of these things that you can run in a server that you get for maybe up to 15 minutes, let's say, and basically you're going to be using excess capacity in the cloud and paying a very discounted rate for that because it's a spot instance. You're only guaranteed it for a certain period of time, and it may get taken away from you. But the truth is, if you can have workflows that can run on those that are not critical to your real-time operations, that's a really cost-effective way of running those workflows. And then there are on-demand instances where I'm just running the server when I need it, and there's right sizing, which means you're actually going to make sure that you're running the right size server for just the workflow you want. And it's typically something that you do through microservices and containers to really manage the size of your workload within a server and be able to share that server amongst multiple different workloads. You also want to reduce egress, because we talk about egress being one of the big costs with end-to-end cloud workflows, meaning you're not going to move content back and forth from the cloud to on-premises for different parts of workflow. It means you're going to put the whole workflow in the cloud so the content can stay up there, and you only egress it when it's time to actually view it or give it to customers. And then to make that work, you probably want proxy-based workflows. So instead of doing high-resolution streaming to your desktop to do workloads, you're doing actually proxies. It means that if you're going to be distributing content to multiple recipients, you figure out how to do multicast at the edge, since you can't do multicast to most clouds, to save from doing unicast streams to every single recipient. And that's where content delivery networks come into play as well, especially for OTT delivery. And finally, connections to and from the cloud for these data and streams. If you use things like Direct Connect, which is Amazon's version of MPLS networks or private networks, there's also a discount that applies across to your network costs, so that actually is a benefit there while giving you even higher performance. And lastly, you're going to be storing content in the cloud. Be sure to implement hierarchical tiered storage and archives to make sure that you're only paying for storage at the premium prices for the content you need immediate access to. So now it's decision time. You've figured out what you want to put in the cloud. You've kind of figured out what the workflows are going to look like. You've done some pricing. You've evaluated various things. And it's time to choose vendors and suppliers. So how do we do that? Well, first we want to find vendors that understand and build with cloud cost in mind. Anybody who's doing managed services or SaaS models automatically has that, but others might as well. You want to have optimized and orchestrated for the cloud. So if you're paying for this, you'll quickly figure this out and do this if you're building your own systems as a managed service or a SaaS model, which is why they have this. They'll know about this serverless or a function as a service that we talked about a minute ago, on-demand and spot compute instances. They'll leverage native cloud services, so they're not actually standing up and paying for licenses for things they need to use just for short periods of time. And they'll also understand the challenges of having a single cloud versus multi-clouds and hybrid clouds. So one of the challenges you have is anybody who's building technology for the cloud has limited development resources. And those development resources can be spent running more efficiently in a particular cloud and adding more features to what they can do in that cloud, or they can spend those same resources, instead of adding capabilities and being more cost effective, figuring out how to run the same workloads in different clouds or on-premise systems and cloud systems, which is what multi-cloud and hybrid cloud systems are. And so therefore, if you really look for somebody who's going to be really efficient, they're likely also going to be less likely to support multiple clouds. Or they're going to say, we support multiple clouds, but this is the one we prefer, because this is one we really focus our energies on. And it's just the way it is, honestly. It's not to say that one cloud is necessarily better than another, but this is the way the business is going and the way the clouds themselves have been working to attract M&E business. So then you have a choice. You have vendors who come from being legacy broadcast and media technology companies, and you have cloud native companies. To be cloud native, there are companies that are actually utilizing cloud services from the beginning and technologies, and from the moment they write their first line of code, they know what those capabilities are in the cloud, they know what those capabilities cost, and they figure out where to run every line of code and every function they want to do for most efficiency, for most cost savings, and for best performance. And that, therefore, in doing that, to also build systems that can launch faster, scale better, and bring more cloud benefits. But you may have a challenge because those cloud native companies and cloud first companies, because they're cloud first, may have been built for something, maybe only OTT workflows, or maybe for certain kinds of customers. And they may not bring all the benefits and features you need for your existing workflows. So this is where legacy systems are migrating to the cloud. And you have to look carefully at those because they may actually check all the right boxes for the things you've been looking for and you expect to bring with you to the cloud, but they may not be as efficient or as optimized. So this is part of the test we're going to do coming up here. We need to figure out which systems can we use and how many of those legacy features do we really need in the cloud, or are they things we can be discarded? And how much do these new cloud native vendors really understand what I do as a customer and for my business? So the selection process. First step is to build that cloud center of excellence and engage all the stakeholders in your organization: IT, engineering, operations, finance, programming, sales, and traffic. All these stakeholders should have a voice in the selection because it's going to matter to all of them. They're all going to bring certain requirements to the table. And you're also going to have to work with all of them to make sure those are real requirements and not just bringing that old baggage with them, right? That's going to be a challenge. You're going to have to be a good politician to make this work well. So the process can use any of these three: an RFI, a request for information, an RFP, request for proposal, and a POC, proof of concept. All of these will take time and potentially slow down your migration, but to also provide really valuable information and decision points along the way. An RFI is simply due to engage vendors you think really have innovative ideas and are really leading edge in the industry to find out what is possible today and where are they going and what you should be thinking about as you make this move, because there may be things we're not even thinking of here. And we'll talk about some of those in the next episode, some of the things I'm working with on various customers as they move forward here. But there are different ways of looking at how we solve the same problems we've been solving for the last 60 years and how we do this in the cloud. And so an RFI is a chance to really learn from the technologists out there. What would they recommend? And where are they thinking these days? Where are they headed? From that, you build your strategy and your plan and your vision for what you want to be doing in the cloud, and that greenfield approach we talked about at the very beginning. And you go from there and you do an RFP, request for proposal, to various vendors where you're trying to define who can actually achieve what you want and at what price. And you want to lock in that price now. You don't want to wait until later after you've figured out there's one vendor who really does it all and they know that, and then they give you a price. And lastly, a proof of concept. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think it's really important to do proof of concepts in this work, in this migration. So before you begin all these processes, first know your own project timeline so that suppliers know deadlines for responses and development deliverables. And define those must-have criteria that will spare non-compliant vendors from participating. There's no point in beating up some vendor to participate and go through all these processes if there are certain features that you must require that they don't have and they cannot deliver in time. Being able to cut them out of the list, while it may seem painful, is actually being kind to them and being kind to yourself, because there's one more set of responses and one more solution you won't have to evaluate if there are certain litmus test criteria that you can establish from the very beginning. And be clear about your own objectives. Really understand those tests and make sure that they're meaningful to your business objectives. So we talk about the RFI, and it really seeks to determine the current state of the art in technology and vendor capabilities. And it helps you avoid setting your project requirements too high or too low. I have seen customers who put out RFPs for projects that nobody can meet, or maybe only one vendor can meet, and they know only one vendor can meet that, and they're therefore going to be stuck with that one vendor and whatever that vendor wants to charge them. And really, what we do isn't all that different from customer to customer and vendor from vendor. There's only so much value in being unique. I hate to say it, but it's true. So The RFI is going to inform the RFP and POC process. It should not be complex. The goal is to allow suppliers to evangelize how they see the industry evolving and create guardrails around customer expectations and define roadmaps and developments that inform customer expectations. The RFI can all be done at the very outset of the project. You don't have to wait until we run through those other steps we talked about before. You can do the RFI very early on to start figuring out who are the vendors that are interesting to talk to about this and where is the technology going. So the RFP locks in vendor pricing. You don't want to winnow the contenders down to a single one and then ask for pricing, right? An RFP is a detailed response that defines vendor current capabilities and deliverables at specific timeframes. So you want to understand what can they deliver today at time of purchase, or when you're building a system or launch, or what won't be available until post-launch but they'll still commit to delivering. The RFP should have a compliance matrix. You can make this as simple or as complex as you want, but it should be meaningful to you as the customer. It should have the features you should eliminate non-compliant vendors unless they can propose an acceptable workaround. And if your vendor pricing is platform as a service, it should indicate expected cloud infrastructure and operating costs. You should be able to ask the vendor, what do I need to run your recommended workflow? So the old way we used to refresh facilities is first thing we retained a systems integrator. And this is not to pick on systems integrators, because there are now systems integrators doing the cloud, which is great, and doing really great work in the cloud. But in the old school model, when you're building on premises, first thing was to retain a systems integrator, because none of us had a large enough staff to build a brand new facility while keeping the current one running. And they helped us to evaluate and pick solutions based on their past experiences, demos we might have seen in the recommendations, right? And out of that, we would spend 6 months in a design phase and then end up often being surprised by the budget. We spend the next 12 to 18 months in approvals, getting that funding because it exceeded what we expected, acquiring the different technologies, having them delivered, commissioned, turned up, troubleshooted, and finally being able to put them on air. And that's not unusual that whole process is 18 months, maybe 24 months if we even have to refresh the building it's going into. And to migrate to the cloud and discover an entirely new set of issues doesn't make sense, right? To build all this on-premise system and then think you're going to move that same system to the cloud as a parallel system is going to create a whole bunch of new issues, because the system that you build on premises may not be optimized for the cloud. So that's the old way. I would say the new way is the POC is used to test a range of solutions that are deemed acceptable from the RFP responses. So basically, you take all those RFP responses and you pick the top end of those and you say, we'd like to invite you to do POCs. And the vendor will then stand up their system in a VPC running under your account. And this is key. First off, it's running under your account so that you can actually measure the cost, but also so that you can run it as long as you want without the vendor absorbing that cost, because they're going to be reluctant if you ask them to pay for it. But truthfully, you want to know what those costs are. It's a small part of your final operation here. So you build independent vendor sandboxes, each with their own VPC. It allows you to evaluate multiple systems simultaneously without any interaction or exposure between them. You can directly measure their true cloud operating cost per solution. This is really key, because now I did my spreadsheet, I figured out what I thought they would cost, they told me what they were needed to run, but when I run it, I can really see the truth. And I can gain insight on the functionality, architecture, and services used. My team can actually use the system and make sure it meets their requirements. Operations can become satisfied with it. And I'll understand the complexity of instantiating, moving, and terminating solutions. I'll see how long it takes to stand a system up, how long it takes for the vendor to solve issues. It'll be really instructive. And finally, as I winnow down the list of vendors to the ones I think really could win, we can scale up the systems to very large for short periods of time to make sure that they scale health without failing over, that they're healthy at scale. So this is really the key. And out of this, and what I learned from this was really a surprise. So at one point, when I was doing this, we were doing 6 vendors simultaneously. We started with 10, we winnowed down to 6, and we were standing up 6 in the cloud. And as they were building the workflows, we were measuring these costs. And those costs showed up on a graph. And here I have in blue most of the vendors. but one vendor's cost was the cost in red. It's just this little bit, it's not on top of the blue one. It's the blue and the red separate. And you can see that the red vendor was running something like maybe a tenth to a 20th of the cost of the other vendor. I mean, it was substantially less. And it's exactly the same workload. It's exactly the same requirements, right? And out of that, you can discover who really understands how to leverage the cloud economics and who is really building solutions for the cloud. So I really encourage you to stand up POCs with the vendors you're looking to use to really gain experience, because the cost is not much. You would never have done this in an on-premise system. I've never seen anybody build multiple on-premises systems to decide which one they want to keep. But in the cloud, you can and you should. So then once you've done that and you figured out which is the right vendor, you build your cloud. The POC should have already defined the right partners and suppliers. So really at this point, and you've been monitoring these costs, and you've got features and performance and operator satisfaction and stakeholder acceptance. So now building your cloud is really a matter of turning off the other systems and scaling up the one you want and tightening down the security and making sure the right accesses are in place and is built to actually be operational. But you've already proven it and it's already running. It's beautiful, right? You've got your POC now becomes your on-air system. It's just that simple. So final thoughts. Are you also building a parallel system on premises? Are you building it first? I've seen a lot of customers do this. They want to migrate to the cloud, but they're also but it's part of a larger refresh. So they decide first to build on premises. And once on premises is up and running, because it's what they trust and know, and they get to work with a vendor in an environment they can see them in, they then invite them to, stand up the same system in the cloud. Well, by the time it would take you to build that on-premises system, you could have already run the POC, stood up the system in the cloud, build a redundant cloud system in another region, and be adding enhancements. You'd be so far ahead of the curve, right? And you could actually have your DR in the cloud at the same time without paying for it. So the other thing is, if you really think that you're going to build the on-premise first and then move to the cloud, you're probably going to find that the system, when it runs in the cloud, doesn't take advantage of the cloud. Maybe it doesn't even run that well in the cloud. And you'll miss the advantages and lessons learned from the POC. And you end up with a system that is basically an on-premise first, cloud second system. And that's not going to bring you all the benefits of being in the cloud. So our takeaways. Develop a modeling worksheet to understand all-in cloud costs. Design a modern cloud workflow free of legacy constraints. Create that cloud center of excellence with your team. Seek solutions that deliver true cloud efficiencies. And use the RFI, RFP, and POC process to inform your selection and discover the optimum solution. So do we have any questions? All right, we'll do a pickup here. So thanks everyone for joining me on this presentation today. Let's see if we have any questions. Alana, let's take a look and see, do I have any questions coming in here? And we do. Greg asks, how long did it take you to create your cloud modeling worksheet and how did it work out in the end? Well, all in all, it probably took me about 80 to 120 hours the first time that I built, tested, and refined it. I tried at first to enter a lot of the costs manually, but that really became a pain. I then tried to import the entire cost data using the AWS API, but it overran my Google Sheets and didn't import very well into Excel either. I probably could have done a lot better at this programmatically, but that would have taken even longer as my coding skills are getting a little rusty. So I tried to take a shortcut and I chose each of the vendors to supply an all-in cost worksheet, and that didn't work out so well either. Out of the over 20 vendors I evaluated on that particular project, only one actually provided this information, so that didn't solve my problem either. I still needed to figure out how to get a handle on those costs. So finally I realized some shortcuts as I was building these worksheets. The first one is that the common costs are independent of what vendors I choose. The cost of moving content to and from the cloud are going to be the same. So I could actually model those separately and only do it one time. And that was pretty straightforward. And I could actually use real cloud costs. And there weren't too many variables to manage in the table and update if the cloud costs changed, so I could do that one pretty easily. For the vendor costs, I then used the Amazon online calculator to make the calculations and linked for each vendor and each part of their workflow, their cost to my worksheet. So basically, I could go into that cost calculator and say, okay, for this part of your workflow, this is what you're standing up and this is how much it needs to run. And I could do that calculation, bring that cost back over, and also have a link to that so I could always update it remote easily. Then I broke those down into separate components like workflow management and delivery, so I could substitute different solutions for each component. And therefore also, if some vendors didn't have some features or options others had, I wasn't comparing apples to oranges. I could take those things out. And in the end, I was actually able to accurately forecast the cost of various solutions we evaluated with less than an actual 10% difference from the actual cost we showed when we actually stood them up, which is amazing. Actually, I was surprised by that too. So it definitely can be done. Another question. Rick asks, what became the biggest influence in the final decision making? Great question, Rick. So I knew I wanted to be able to leverage everything the cloud could do for us today and even more benefits tomorrow, right? I knew we wanted to make sure we were going to a solution that was going to take us there. But we also knew we had a significant legacy operation that we cannot simply abandon, and we needed to fit into the migration. We also had a number of requirements that had to be supported. Things like frame-accurate timing of events, because this was actually a playout system, and I had a lot of stations who were not using SCSI triggers who needed frame-accurate insertion for their own breaks. They could not depend upon anything but the clock to do that. And we also had things like Dolby AC3 encoding, closed captions, Nielsen watermarking, and such. And those were things that a lot of overseas suppliers who seemed to be first in going to the cloud and building cloud-native systems did not support. So that became a big problem. Because we looked at several of these cloud-native, cloud-first solutions, but really none of them were ready. They didn't support those requirements, mostly because they were overseas, or they just had workflows and interfaces that operators would have killed me if we had picked them, right? It's like, what were you thinking when you designed this user interface? Did you understand how an operator works in a modern broadcast facility? So it became really a challenge to do this. So at the end of the day, I thought we were going to be limited to just the familiar, trusted brands, and we'd join one of them in our journey to the cloud. But the problem was a lot of those trusted brands were very early in their journey to the cloud. This was a couple years ago, and certainly were not optimized, and really not even ready. So we were between a rock and a hard place. Except it didn't quite work out that way. And so what happened was we ended up in this process having one of the cloud native vendors come back to us. And this is one that did all the right functions under the hood. Their core engine was really strong. They were doing Dolby, they were doing Nielsen, they were doing captions. It's like, wow, checking all the right buttons. But I couldn't imagine giving the operators their user interface. And then one day they came back to us early on in the process and said, oh, by the way, we listened to you all and we changed our entire user interface. And I was like, what? How's that even possible? Who does that in an automation world, right? And they had actually changed it to meet the needs of a multi-channel network broadcaster. And not surprisingly, they were also the only cloud native vendor, in fact, the only vendor who accurately projected their cloud operating costs. Really interesting insight there, right? And they were the fastest to stand up their POCs in days, not months like some others. So we brought them back in and made them part of the POC. And in the POC, we saw that we were getting weekly builds to address every feature we found and add requested capabilities. They were also the most cloud efficient. They were the red one on that bar you saw a few minutes ago. And they really were able to run at a fraction of the cost of what other vendors were able to run in the cloud. And the last thing is they never said no to anything. Never. So how do they do that? Well, I think it's really because underneath it, they were true DevOps, they were true cloud native, and they really understood what we were after. So it wasn't really any one thing that won, but it was a vendor who checked all the boxes. That actually was at the end of the day. And that was really a surprise to see one come through that clearly, especially one that we had outright rejected early on in the process. So you never know what you're going to find. But that's why this process is so important, to really go through the POCs and go through the test drives, because you will discover who it is you want to be a partner with in the cloud. And I thank you very much for listening to us. That's it. And we'll see you next time as we talk about some really interesting new ways of interpreting how to make things work in the cloud. I thank you all.